God's creation that makes a connection between us and an unfathomably distant past that the present generation has no right to interrupt. Nuclear weapons lure us into thinking we can control the destiny of the world. They invert order into disorder. They are the ultimate evil. Nuclear weapons are devoid of the slightest shred of moral legitimacy. And prominent jurists consider their use illegal in any possible circumstance. And military leaders have stated that they have no utilitarian value. Well, isn't it astonishing? Despite all this tremendous array of knowledge that has been developed, we still have 23,300 nuclear weapons in existence, many of them many times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US and Russia possess 95% of this number, with the UK, France, and China, the other official members of the nuclear club, holding smaller amounts. India, Pakistan, and Israel also possess nuclear weapons. North Korea has tested a nuclear device, and Iran is accused, again, this week again, accused of trying to turn its nuclear energy program into nuclear weapons. You know, more than half the people of the world live in a nuclear weapons country. And we often think that we're nuclear free in Canada. Well, if you want to be technical about it, I suppose you might say that, except that we're a member of NATO, and NATO has in its doctrine that nuclear weapons are essential and maintains a nuclear umbrella. And so I don't think that Canadians can feel too smug about our role in the world. And I'll come back to NATO in a moment. Virtually every nuclear expert agrees that the threat of a nuclear attack by terrorists is growing because the number of governments possessing nuclear weapons is growing, and thus greater the potential for nuclear terrorists to obtain access to such materials. Not without reason did the former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, say just when he was leaving his office that the world is sleepwalking toward a nuclear calamity. It staggers, it truly staggers the imagination to consider what the enormous sums spent on nuclear weapons, which is $12 trillion by all countries that have nuclear weapons since 1945. 12 trillion. Who can figure out how, with that amount of money? But just try to think of what that sum would have done for education, health, your field, and other requisites for the development of peoples everywhere. Even today, the annual global total of money that is spent on nuclear weapons is $90 billion every year. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the nuclear club that we've talked about, are also the top 5 military spenders in the world. And their spending on conventional as well as nuclear is driving up worldwide military spending, which last year alone reached $1.46 trillion, which was a 45% increase over the past decade. As the International Peace Bureau points out, these new figures show us that weapons and preparations for warfare remain untouchable in most austerity programs. And indeed, they reveal an increasing militarization among the big powers. So the abolition of nuclear weapons is necessary not only because they pose totally unacceptable risks, it is also necessary because a two-tier regime with nuclear haves and have-nots jeopardizes a stable, legal, and political order. Elimination of the two-tier system is needed to effectively tackle the other critical problems facing an interdependent world: climate change and other threats to the environment, wars and terrorism, financial instability, poverty, and disease. I consider the abolition of nuclear weapons a preeminent requisite to obtain peace in the 21st century, to allow us to work on the other threats. So we've now reached a point in human history when one thing is abundantly clear. A two-class nuclear world where one set of countries arrogate unto itself the right to hold nuclear weapons while prescribing their acquisition by anybody else, that's no longer sustainable. The only way to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons is to move the world to zero nuclear weapons. For the day will arrive when either nuclear weapons are abolished or the world is devastated by a nuclear attack. One or the other will happen. No person informed on the gravity of the situation can deny what I have just said. But by their continuing ignoring of the 1996 International Court of Justice ruling that states are required to conclude negotiations toward the elimination of nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapon states have been cavalierly undermining the rule of law. In fact, while professing to support nuclear disarmament by reductions in numbers, while at the same time modernizing their nuclear arsenals and setting in place doctrines that have nuclear deterrence maintained for the foreseeable future, the nuclear powers have been making a farce out of nuclear disarmament. So we now have to see this new resolution, whether what they have signed on to, and they've signed on to this kind of thing before, in the year 2000, whether they will still proceed. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is coming up for review next year. It's reviewed every 5 years. And the test will be in active acceptance of realistic steps with a visible intent to lead to a nuclear weapons-free world. So let's not forget that for a good reason did the Swedish Nobel laureate Alva Myrdal title her book on this subject, The Disarmament Game. The Disarmament Game. It's time to stop treating people as pawns in strategic planning. So steps on the horizon, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty coming into force, negotiation for a ban on the production of fissile materials, these are very important, but they are insufficient without a visible intent to connect the steps to the achievement of a world without nuclear weapons. It's not just the steps, in other words, not just the steps, laudatory as they are, that must be addressed, but doctrine. As long as nuclear retentionists can hold on to the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, they will use it to justify modernizing nuclear weapons. And